Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Stephanie Valdez, and I'm the co-owner at the bookstore. We're happy to collaborate again with our friends at New York Review Books. Tonight, Tom Whalen joins us to discuss his new translation of Robert Walser's Little Snow Landscape in conversation with Edwin Frank. While we're coming up to 1 year of being closed to the public for the pandemic, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have been a bright spot and a form of continuity in this strange year. Thanks to Tom and always to Edwin for joining us. Now for some housekeeping. You should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. If you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of the screen to submit them. We'll be asking those at the end of the program. There's also a chat button here at the bottom through which I'll be posting a link to purchase tonight's book if you haven't already. And finally, we've scheduled a whole host of spring programming, so you can head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. For instance, on March 23rd, Vivian Gornick will join us in conversation with Marco Roth to discuss Taking a Long Look, a collection of essays drawn from almost 5 decades of her work. Now I'll tell you a bit about tonight's guests and we'll get started. Tom Whalen is a novelist, short story writer, poet, critic, and the co-editor of the Robert Walser issue of the Review of Contemporary Fiction. Edwin Frank is the founder and editor of the NYRB Classics series and the author of a book of poems, Snake Train. Please help me welcome Tom and Edwin, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Stephanie, and thanks to Community Bookstore for sponsoring this reading and many other readings and events that we've done throughout the last year. And thank you, Tom, for joining us, and thank you all out there for tuning in. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Tom's translation. He also edited the book of a new collection of short pieces by Robert Walser, Little Snow Landscape, culled from the 20 volumes of the collected writings of this master miniaturist, the miniatures, the piling up over the years. And indeed, I think new work is still turning up, and some of that in old periodicals, and some of that new work, that uncollected work, even in German, is included in Tom's collection. This is the 5th book by Robert Walser that NYRB Classics has published, and which is to say that Walser is an important part of our program as a writer. And it's a rather different book, in a way, well, Walser is always personal, but perhaps a more personal, even autobiographical book compared to the other ones that we've done. It includes playlists, reminiscences, landscape miniatures, fairy tales, portraits of writers, sketches as in some sense Walser is always in a way a sketcher, kind of outlining something and then outlining it slightly differently right by the other outline. And so it's an interesting new view of it. I think it changes the view of readers of English of this great Swiss writer. There's wonderful, among the things in there are 2 dramatic monologues, which are amongst my favorites. One of Don Juan, who's sort of hanging up his hat, and the other of the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who says along the way, what will we become now that they've civilized us? I'm the last sovereign still living in a real palace. In the future, my successors will only live in government buildings. And I feel for the poor sovereign. But we're going to start with a reading to give some of the sense of the Walser voice and Tom's voice as he's translated him. And I think you were going to read home is a subject that Walser, perpetually homeless, writes about. And I think you're going to read something, anyway, I think it was a piece about that you were proposing to read.
Yes, it's the opening of the book which takes us all the way to the closing of the book too, which is called Childhood, also about Walser's home. And it's called To My Home. The sun shines through the little hole into the little room where I am sitting and dreaming. The bells of my homeland chime. It is Sunday, and on Sundays it is morning, and in the morning the wind is blowing, and in the wind all my cares fly away like shy birds. I feel too much the harmonious nearness of home to be able to brood over any sorrow. In the past, I wept. I was so far away from my native country. So many mountains, lakes, forests, rivers, fields, and ravines lay between me and her, the beloved, the admired, the adored. This morning, she embraces me, and I lose myself in her voluptuous caress. No woman has such soft, such imperious arms. No woman, not even the most beautiful, such tender lips. No woman, not even the most tender, kisses with such infinite ardor as my native land kisses me. Ring, bells, play, wind, roar, forest, glow, colors, and it's all embodied in the single sweet kiss of my homeland that in this moment captivates my language in the sweet, infinitely delicious kiss of home.
That is very Robert Walser. Walser's become almost a kind of legendary figure, sort of, as I said, in a way homeless, and of course, eventually at the end of his life in a home for the insane. This book sort of spans the whole course of his career. And I think it'd be useful if you could fill us in a little bit about who he was and what and his life, because it was as much of the world in some ways, or at least for a long time, as it was as otherworldly as it sometimes can see. It seemed.
Yes, well, briefly, Walser was born on April 15th, 1878 in Biel, which is probably what he's talking about here, To My Home. And he'll talk about it in the last story in the collection, Childhood. And there, in the middle of the book, there's a letter from Biel that he gives us. And he was in a large family. I think 5 brothers, 2 sisters. The father ran a shop. He sold goods of various kinds. His mother was a depressive who dies when Walser, I think, is 16. His oldest brother dies when he's 15. Another brother dies in the mental institution that Walser will enter in 1929. I think that brother dies in 1918. Another brother was a geography professor who committed suicide. The sister that he was closest to was Lisa, and you can see her portraits of her, variations on her in the Lisa figure in Jakob von Gunten, and also in Walser's first novel, The Tanners. His slightly older brother that he was closest to was Karl Walser, who was a well-known artist and stage designer and book illustrator. He did stage designs for Max Reinhardt. And Walser left school at age 14 and to apprentice as a bank clerk. Worked around Switzerland in various places, tried to become an actor. As a youngster, he's in his late teens, and not successful. There's a story in the collection that deals with that called Wenzel. And he goes to Stuttgart also to try and do some more study in acting, also to work. And from Stuttgart, he's been to Basel and elsewhere working already. But from Stuttgart, he goes to Zurich, where he spends approximately the next 9 years of his life. Then he'll go to Berlin. Berlin years are more or less 1904, 1905 to 2000 to 1912. In Berlin, he tries to become a successful writer. He publishes a lot. He has several books out.
The novels come out then, don't they? The novels come out in these years, right? Jakob von Gutten.
1907, 1908, and 1909.
Yeah.
Tanner's Der Gehilfe, the assistant, and then Jakob von Gutten, Walser's favorite of his own, of the longer works. And then spends time in a school for butlers while he's in Berlin, and works as a butler at a Castle Dombrau in Upper Silesia.
Is there any understanding of why having set out to become a writer, and the writers he refers to in his work are, very elevated figures indeed, Kleist and Hölderlin and so on, that why was he just out of money and this seemed the best way to make some money? Why he entered this school for servants? Because it really becomes, of course, it's a theme, not only in Jakob von Gutten, but in this book too, the lackey, the servant,
Yeah. Why does Walser do that? Psychologically, I don't know. It was a way to make money, but his primary way to make money was as a copyist and as a clerk, which is what he did in Zurich. But mostly he would work in order to save up enough money to write. And as to why he became a servant and then takes on that persona, it's one that apparently suited him. Even in Biel, he will answer the door of his attic room at the Hotel zum, the Blue Cross Hotel zum Blaue Kreuz. He'll answer the door and pretend to be a servant and tell them that Herr Walser is not at home. So this was a persona of many personas that he uses in his writing and also somewhat in his life that he adopts. He refers to it in his novel that he never even submitted, much less made a copy of to submit for publication. The Robber, his last completed novel around 1925. He refers to his character as having an innate adaptability. And he's talking about his ability to do what he calls a damseling, where he takes on the persona and gestures of a female. So his innate adaptability is something that Walser, I think that's part of the servant role that he played in life and on the page both.
What does he do during the war? He's Swiss and he's in Switzerland, so he's presumably non-combatant.
He's non-combatant, but he's serving in the military. So he's in various places all over Switzerland doing military service, and writes about that. And in English, we have a series of pieces in a schoolboy's diary, Damien Searles's collection with New York Review Books. During the war years, there are a few pieces here and some that was in the earlier collection that I did, Girlfriend's Ghost and Other Stories. And I quote in the biographical note, I quote a brilliant letter that he writes to Hermann Hesse about the war years and doing wartime service in Switzerland.
And these pieces are published as sort of as feuilletons and papers, right? The short pieces. It's only the novels that he really gets published in collections, or does he have shorter? Are there collections of shorter pieces published during his life?
There are many collections of shorter pieces. I forget how many exactly, but like 10 or 11 of the 15 books that published. His I think 1919 was the last time he has a collection out until 1925. So there's a 6-year gap with no book.
Mhm.
In 1925, his final collection appears, that is during his writing career, De Rosa, which is his most extreme prose in published form that we have during his writing career, which ends in 1933. But no, he was more prolific as a short story writer than as a novelist, at least in terms of getting things published. And the collections, I'm looking at them up on a mantelpiece right now, and there are yeah.
So I mean, he actually published a good deal. He was not excluded from the publishing world.
Not at
There
all.
was an audience for his work that.
Yeah, and they didn't appear just in the feuilleton section of newspapers. They appeared in major anthologies and major literary journals, and so he was. You'll find him in collections with Rilke, with any number of well-known, better-known writers.
So in a way, I mean, you talked about his various other personae, the young woman, also certain romantic writers, and so. But in a way, Robert Walser himself is a certain kind of persona that he was also. I mean, this writer who. I mean, I think of characteristic Walserisms like saying, the window was square, or actually maybe it was rectangular. I mean, the way in which he adds something, he's more precise, but in fact actually makes you more uncertain by virtue of being precise.
Yeah, so parts are that it was
recognized as a very specific voice.
Yeah, it can be in the shape of a window too. A window in the shape of a window. Yes, that's one of the
eventually, though, the collapse. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
The collapse. I mean, it comes because he's not really making a living, and his family, his sister doesn't really want to look after him or doesn't want him to move in, and that he finally moves into a sanitarium of some sort, right?
Yeah, in 1929. Someone who will be much better versed than probably anybody else in the English language world is Susan Bronowski, and her biography of them is coming out in late May. So I stay away from the biography to some extent, and have concentrated on other things, critical work and on translation sometimes. But in the mid-20s. He's moved to Bern from Biel, and somewhat in search for new motifs. He felt he had exhausted his home, and goes to Biel for a job too, which he leaves after a few months, and then begins a incredibly productive time writing. And he had a productive time in Biel. It was a fascinating period of writing for him, but in Bern, he shifts somewhat to another kind of prose. It's still the Walser spirit. It's highly ludic. It's alert to the small things in the world. It's alert to literature on a high level, and also on the lowest of low levels, the Bahnhof Holland Buchlein that he likes to read, the little dime store novels, and he'll do these fantastic improvisations off of these books. But something happens in the mid-20s when he's working on The Robber, which it's like a psychogram, an X-ray in some ways of the anxieties that Walser was experiencing. I don't know exactly what happened, but one thing that happens, of course, is it's something called middle age, and by the time in 1929 he is he is living in an apartment. I think he has two landladies. During the last couple of months, I think he proposes to each one of them. He's suffering obviously from extreme anxiety and depression. He says he's suicidal, but only halfway so, nothing really serious, he says, and begins to have oral hallucinations, and he's just in extreme psychic stress. At that point, Lisa talks him into seeing Dr. Morgenthaler, who recommends that Walser go to Waldau and commit himself, and Walser agrees to do that. One of the myths that should be put to rest, there are various myths around Walser, and one of them is that Walser was schizophrenic. What happens, as I understand it, is that when he goes to Waldau, Dr. Morgenthaler has written a letter recommending that Walser go there. That letter does not arrive until after Walser has already committed himself. The attending physician that interviews him have asked him various questions. Walser says yes, he's been depressed, but the suicide, he was just half-hearted attempts. But he's willing and there to volunteer himself for the Waldau clinic. And then, as the interview goes on, he finally admits to hearing voices. At which point, apparently, the attending physician, rather than checking tentative diagnosis, checks definitive diagnosis and writes schizophrenia. And no one who was a schizophrenic could even answer the questions in the way Walser was answering them, nor it would be very likely that they would voluntarily commit themselves. Mm-hmm. So that's how that starts. Now, 4 years later, when they change policy at the Institute, they're willing to let him go. Because they want to concentrate only on serious, severe cases, and Walser's not one of them. Walser, in the meantime, has settled in. I recall, these are some old memories of mine. I started this a long time ago. He was asked at one point if he wanted to have a room to himself where he could write, and Walser says no. He did not want to be alone. He put me in the dorm with all the other beds. So he's in a room with all these beds. So he wants to be around people. So here they want to release him to a farm family, and that's not something that Walser would have wanted. He wanted to stay with his sister Lisa at the school where she teaches Bellawai. But Lisa did not want that, and she, and I think with help from the administration at her school, sees that Walser will be transferred elsewhere to a clinic in the canton of his home canton, so to speak, though he never lived there, in eastern Switzerland, where he would know no one, and here he's out. Walser says, no, you said I could be let go, so let me go. And they won't allow that, and they send him off to Herisau. They have to forcibly, as I understand it, put him in a transportation facility to get to eastern Switzerland. He continues to fight his being sent there. He wants to be let out. He goes to court. He loses the case, and they make him pay. He has his own money. He's not taking money from the government there. He could afford to be out. He wasn't that poor at this point. He had received 2 small inheritances in the 20s. But he lost the case, and they made him pay the court costs too. So,
and after that confinement, he stops writing,
well, yes, he may have still written some. There's some possibility of that, but we have nothing.
Nothing that's come down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so discuss. We'll have a reading in a minute, another reading. But what was your I mean, there's all this, as I said, 20 volumes of Walser's work in German. What were you thinking of when you put together this particular selection?
I had various things in mind, but two primary ones. One was that there were important key texts to Walser's canon that had not been translated before, that I thought were central to an understanding and appreciation of Walser. And those were pieces like The Writer, Wenzel, heroine. There are two pieces dealing with mad writers, Lintz, one of the playlets, and heroine. Würzburg, another autobiographical story. Louise, another autobiographical story. A sort of narrative, also a central text, I think, in understanding Walser. And the final piece in the collection, Childhood. So these were pieces that I wanted very much to be there. The other thing I wanted was, which you've already hinted at, was that I wanted a book that gave us Walser in a tighter focus than any of the other collections had, though some of them have a contextual focus, Berlin stories.
Yeah.
But I wanted something that gave us Walser, that gave us a sense of Walser's writing as a whole, but also focused on him in a more autobiographical or personal way.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, what I wanted was to have a book that was, to a degree, a novel that followed, in a sense, the Walser arc, which will happen if you do it loosely chronological, which this collection does year by year, and one that has texts that link together, either from beginning to end, as in the first story and the last story, or that link from early to late, as in Stroll 1 and Stroll 2, or that are coupled together, that are about a similar figure, like Bertha and Louise, very short, very long, but this is a little couplet, so to speak. The couplet that you've already picked up in a way of farewell, our Turkish sultans being deposed, and Don Juan's letter. So these two personae, but also not just couplets, but also linking from story to story. A story like Pencil Note ends with our figure, I'm looking it up, that ends with the narrator saying, now I'm going to smoke a cigarette and think about a small town. The next piece is a letter from Biel. Biel, that piece ends as letter to Frida Mermet. That story ends with him talking about snow. I hope it snows vigorously this winter. Isn't that your wish as well? Snow is so beautiful. You love it too, don't you? And then that goes to the first poem that Walser writes, which he writes in the cold, in the snow. So you have things that link that way. You have thematic links. So things that would hold the book together. The various stories that are about writing, his own writing, or that are about him writing, that are about writers, that are about his reading.
Writers and writing, yeah.
and reading too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and the other thematic links, but there are and so you have these sort of three tentpole autobiographical stories, but also these other little structures that I think help hold it together. And again, the kind of arc that takes us from Zurich to Berlin to Biel to the landscape stories.
Yeah.
The centerpiece of the book being midpoint, more or less being Louise, that great long story, and then to into, I guess the turning point might be when Don Juan says that he's used up this role and something else, something new is about to happen. And then we move into the more firmly into the Bernese prose, which gets more artificial, but just as playful, and also not artificial, just as straightforward too in ways as he can be.
That's almost a Walserian formation, this, but also not this in a way.
That's right.
I mean, it's interesting reading through the book that Walser's voice, which is inimitable in a way, which is curiously only his voice, but also plural, because it seems to be continually in dialogue with itself. What are you talking about? What do we mean by this? There's a sort of questioner who is present in the, who also sort of posits certain images and then begins to sort of erase them around the edges a little bit, that almost literal visual sketching things, so that you blur, you know, there's something that was very precise and concrete becomes almost a shadow of itself on the page.
Self-dissolving, almost dissolves, and right before your eyes, the sentences can dissolve.
Yeah, and then the sort of the ends, which will be then somebody did something and then somebody did something else or something, you know, but there is a real, there are different styles in this book, which as you said, sort of represents the arc of Walser's, both the thread and of his concerns and of his life, but also the arc of his stylistic development. So the early pieces are in a way more obviously lyrical. The late ones are, I guess, what we would call experimental. And I even wonder, since some of them are from the microscripts, right, where he's writing in very specific, or is that not the case here?
Well, that's another part of the kind of misinformation about Walser, or misconstruction. The microscripts he was writing in microscript early on in his life, and then it gets smaller and smaller. But the microscripts in part were written not just because he said he had a cramp in his hand, a writing cramp, but it was designed to force him to do a revision and to do a fair copy in order to submit them. He was writing so much that he didn't do fair copies on everything, and he must have known that a novel like The Robber, he could never have found a publisher for it anyway, having had his last novels rejected and they were lost or destroyed. So he wrote pretty much everything in the 20s, certainly in the mid to late 20s, in microscript, and then he would revise it. But he wrote so much he didn't revise everything. So the microgramma is far from being the secret code that Zelig originally thought, and Graven just pointed out that no, it's actually German and you can read it. But it's also not. It's rough. They're rough drafts, and they're at an extreme edge in some cases, and some of those pieces were made fair copies of, and frequently they will have paragraphs when he does that. Not always, but he'll start paragraphing. He'll revise them a little bit. He'll even title some of the microscripts that were never revised, but not very many.
So that's interesting, because that answers the question I had about the later work, which was that I was wondering whether he was almost giving himself an arbitrary space to fill out, writing on a matchbook or something. And in effect, you know, he could write, it was a form of free association within a limited space, but not really. I mean, these were drafts, as you were saying.
Yeah.
But why don't you? Because these are more almost like figurative paintings, but with in an abstract framework. Why don't you? You were going to read, I think, Book Review or one of these later pieces that show this kind of quite different tone from the one you were that we heard before.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, this is from 1928, 29. So that late period before he will commit himself. Book Review. Hui was the name of a female bit player in the movies. It was more a waggish than a piquant, elegant name. The story played out in Paris. The streets shimmered cosmopolitanly. I don't wish to take this too far. The present book review will boast only scant range. That's what we're dealing with here. The twinkling, whispering Eiffel Tower immersed its gigantic shape fairy tale-like in the mirror of the Seine. The author of the little bookie confides to me that Hui had operated the typewriter before she embarked on a career in the movies and got to know a movie chap, or man, who suggested without the least ado that she become his mistress. Aggrieved, she said to him, "How do you come by this arrogance that induces me to be astonished before the eyes of an otherwise apparently quite passable person undeserving of being present at such a scene?" She left, and the first movie man was as good as done for. In the eveningness, she made a, certainly at first, still indecipherable, dark, but nonetheless gradually brightening acquaintance in the form of movie man number 2, who appeared capable of appreciating Hui's sensibility. In delicacy, deference, etc., he resembled a hitherto never before beheldness. He didn't say right away to the helpless pretty girl, "I love you and invite you to dominate me." He waited, tapping her hand in the meantime and saying, "Oh, you artist," a remark that instilled her with trust in him. Girls, especially the beautiful ones, aren't fond of being indelicately, incautiously reminded of the so-called purpose of their existence, which is sufficiently well known to themselves. Their affections are most likely gained by someone adept at sidling around the all too obvious. Beauty is always, as it were, prudish and needs to be felt, comprehended, tolerated. Be that as it may, Hui, on the basis of a thus favorable agreement she entered into with the second movie man, acquired a splendid apartment. I read the little novel swiftly and at the same time tranquilly. The windows of my room stood open. From outside, the voices of passers-by seeped into my literary pursuits and abode, which, for the sake of the present experiment, I wish to call a book review studio. One day, Hui's heart began to declare itself, and that she conveyed the news to her benefactor, whom she felt entitled and obliged to regard as such, that she preferred to leave him and go back to typewriting. Upon taking delivery of the declaration of her decision, the recipient of her letter containing the announcement said, "She loves me, and since luckily I love her as well, and probably the only reason why she would prefer not to love me would be that somehow she acquired the chance to take notice of my love. She seems to be a precious valuable, and we both seem suited for conjoining. In fact, she became his. Somewhere in the morning breeze or evening glaze, islands rose from the sea. Elsewhere, someone seeking a devotional service might have been entering a cathedral. High up in the mountains lay eternal snow. Yet again, fresh proof of my sedulity in the practice of literature seems to have come off as quite strange.
Yeah, right.
Mm.
That yeah, those late pieces are almost. I mean, if the earlier pieces are a bit like, seem to be like sketches where the eraser is as present as the pencil. These late things are sort of like free improvisations on given themes, and these motifs that that your book brings out continued to obsess him really throughout his writing life. There are sort of key words throughout. You read the piece about home to begin with. There are books throughout this. We've talked a little bit about, with his interest in servitude, the servant who is taken on by a noble woman, but also his interest in insignificance, as if the most significant thing could be insignificance. So that plays off against a real German sense of the great writer like Hölderlin, the mad writer Lenz or Büchner and so on. I was struck, and inevitably, because we're publishing this as an NYRB classic, that there's an ongoing interest in the classics throughout this. And in fact, I think the last or next to last sentence of Childhood, the last piece in the book, says, study the classics. And that there is, he have him wandering around from, going on long treks and so on, but also endlessly burying himself in books. And I'm not sure what question I'm formulating, but how do you see this interplay of these sort of different motifs and themes, and as you tried to bring it out?
Little by little, he learned of the contents of the classics. We have him earlier in Wenzel, he's studying the classics. He goes to the bookstore and buys the English writer, that is Shakespeare, and buys Schiller. That's another one of the threads that we have in the book, is Schiller's The Robbers, which shows up there at the beginning and then elsewhere, and then in a sort of narrative, and it shows up as a hidden, a little giant Easter egg. He keeps pointing to, what source is poking through the grass? What source is telling the story? And all of that's this threading of Schiller. You have Goethe as a character in Lenz. You have Goethe mentioned in Four Characters. So, and then on the other hand, you have what I just read, one of those dime store novels that he does an improvisation on. You have in Walser constant dialectical play. You have constant movement. Things in motion is what always is there, and finally you get this. But even though he seems to be teetering, he never does, and you have this balance, this elegance. The dance comes to an elegant end. It can balance itself in Four Characters with the angel and with the devil and the angel having a colloquy, and then the figure in the middle, the hybrid between angel and devil, hybrid. And then at the end you end up with angel and then devil, and then the hybrid as the penultimate line before the fourth character comes in, who is God. So you have this balance that will occur within sentences. You'll have this is Walser. This is at the end of Essay on Freedom from Selected Stories. Walser considers himself a connoisseur and gourmet of freedom, who notes and cherishes all the unfreedoms internal to freedom. So, in reading that story, when I was, had pieces in selected stories, but when I came across Essays on Freedom, this is something that I had to hold in my head, and this is where Walser operates. anyone who wants to talk about freedom has to understand the unfreedoms internal to freedom. And that's a contradiction that most people are not going to be able to manage. But it's a contradiction that Walser lived with all the time. It kept him alive. It kept him fresh. It kept him alert to the world. It kept him appreciating the world. And you can find these contradictions, these paradoxes, this dialectical dance operating throughout his work, and piece after piece. And so classics and not classics, but he was it's at the end of Dostoevsky's Idiot, which one of the translations I have in Selected Stories. He says, "I'm sorry, I'm not." He's done this nice little riff on Dostoevsky's Idiot. "I'm sorry, I'm not the hero of a novel. I'm not up to playing such a part. I just read a lot sometimes." Walser was a reader, and that too is one of the themes that are thread.
Well, why don't we take some questions at this point? And so.
Okay.
Okay, I'm back to ask some of the questions. And if you haven't asked your question yet, you can still do so by just clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Ron Jansen asks, "I'm curious about the level of seriousness on page 7 in The Writer, where he mentions the health hazards of sitting at one's desk for extended periods of time. Literary writing is as hazardous as saving a drowning child from a flood. What was Walser's sense of being a writer?"
Edwin, you want to answer that? I can. This passage goes, if sometimes someone brave succeeds in rescuing a child or whatever might be in mortal danger from the rushing waters, more often than not, it could be held that art and the self-sacrificing efforts of a writer can snatch from the stream of life, carelessly and heedlessly flowing past, the values of beauty on the verge of perishing and drowning, imperiling his own health, since it's not health for 10 to 13 hours at a stretch at his novel or novella desk. And that's true, it's not. Nor is it healthy for the translator. I was doing 10 to 15 hour days in cold Stuttgart winters, and it was not the best thing to do for my lower back. So that's one of the hazards. The other hazard that Walser points out that we see, and that is mentioned in The Writer too, is that you can be very poor and not have enough money to eat well. So there are many hazards to writing, but there's also a value to it that he says, well, you may not be saving a child's life or something else, but you're saving beauty, you're saving values that will vanish otherwise, that you have to save yourself. This is what writers can do. So to that extent, he's comparing himself to someone who saves a life, but not a strict comparison.
Should we go on to the next question?
And unless Edwin wants to.
No, and I actually am getting I have quite an unstable connection, so I'm losing a lot of what you were saying. So okay. I'm not quite sure why, but go on. So let's ask the question. Continue.
We'll keep going. Okay, Kate Dimling says, you mentioned the microscripts as a way for Walser to make himself revise later. Do we know anything about how much he revised? He seems like a very spontaneous writer, but maybe that is just the Walser voice or persona.
Well, hello, Dr. Dimling. She's I think has her doctorate in French from Columbia. Walser, and I almost forgot the question. Walser did revise, and you can, his first novel, The Tanners, is written in hand, and you can look at the manuscript, the original manuscript, and there's maybe one or two words crossed out. He does that without revising at all, basically without revising at all. Other works are revised more, but also what Werner Morlang and Bernhard Echte, the transcribers of the Mikrogramma, what they thought that Walser did was to, and that writing in microscript was part of this, was to write slowly. There seems to be a speed to his thought and a quickness of his thought on the page that they think was something that was not there just right off the top of his head, but he was actually writing slowly to create this rapidity of this seeming rapidity of thought. So you can revise here. you can revise before you put the pencil to the page.
Interesting. Ben Zuckert asks, in The Assistant, Walser has a very quick send-up of socialism, writing in a satirical way, how it was the young hot thing at the time. If Walser were alive today, what do you think he would write about?
Well, his topics were so wide-ranging, and he could write brilliant parodies. He could write political satires. He could write very political works like Masters and Workers, and he could write on the insignificant things too, seemingly insignificant. In one of the stories, he in Children in Small Houses from Little Snow Landscape, he says, "Nothing of significance shall be said here," which, of course, turns out to contradict itself. And that is, in fact, what is significant. Nothing of significance shall be said here, and that makes it significant then. So the insignificance, as Edwin suggested, is highly significant for Walser. So he could be writing about anything, I think. I hate to speculate about Walser in 2021. Someone who was born in 1878 and stops writing essentially in 1933. Had a hard time. He knew that his publishers were no longer able to publish. Most of them were Jewish, and he knew that would have been the world he was trying to go back to had he left the asylum. Someone who was around well before there were automobiles. So I hate to even think about Walser in 2021. It's not that it's not a good question.
I feel like I have to interject. I mean, don't you think that, I mean, his writing, I mean, still does have a very fresh approach.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, he would be writing, definitely.
What do you think brings that that freshness to the page? What do you think makes his writing, I mean, certainly enjoy such a revival in the 2000s?
Yeah. For some people, Walser always has an ironic mask on, and for Martin Walser, no relation, one could not find the bottom for Walser's irony. Usually, you can say, the irony stops here, but for Walser, Martin Walser sees no bottom. You just keep going down and down. There are times, though, when the mask lifts. And what keeps Walser writing at the end of A Little Ramble, he says, we don't need to see anything out of the ordinary. We already see so much. How he lives, what he sees, the world around him, that's what is alive to him. And he can put pen to page because he has what Middleton refers to as his first first translator of Walser, period, in any language, but in English, Christopher Middleton. He has what Middleton saw as a manifold spirit that is constantly disseminating itself. That becomes very difficult for a translator to pin down. And you can only do so much with that manifold spirit.
Yeah, I would add that there is, he's as sincere as he is ironic. I mean, it's impossible really to, and that, I mean, slipperiness would be in a way the last thing to call it, but that mobility actually of sensibility and that curiosity, which, I mean, one could see Walser responding to phones and tweets and what you will. I mean, he would be certainly fascinated by the social comedy of our devices, and by the earnestness with which we hope that they will actually, pull us together, even as they don't necessarily. I think, but I can't venture to imagine how beautifully he would have done it.
That's right. Yeah, and he did, when cars came around, he did not much like them. After all, they were people on the roads that he used to walk on, but he wrote about them.
Yeah.
We have time for these last two questions. Diana Seibert says, can you speak a little bit about the snow theme throughout the stories and why you chose the story title Little Snow Landscape for the book?
Well, I like that question very much, and yes, here's one of the miniatures. Edwin, would you like to read a miniature now? Do you have time for that?
I don't think we really have time. If I were to read, I mean, I think we do.
Oh, I regret that. A Little Snow Landscape, for one thing, because of the little, because this is the insignificant. Another, because it's one of the small pieces here. And the other is that there is a snow theme throughout in Walser's writing and in this book. I'm thinking of the ending of Snowdrops, a spring flower that comes up, another piece that I translated in Selected Stories. And he's referred to the snowdrops, this little white flower that comes in spring, as these first shy announcers of something beloved by all the world. And he ends a piece with, just wait, the good will come. Goodness is always closer to us than we think. Patience brings roses. This old good saying occurred to me when recently I saw snowdrops. And that white page of snow. I'm also thinking now of the ending of Calvino's Mark of Waldau. Another great writer of endings, master of endings. That's a theme in the book. I loved it. I loved the title, Little Snow Landscape, and even more is the photograph, the painting by Carl Walser that New York Review Books managed to get on this cover, which I was as happy about as I was about Walser's writing, seeing Carl Walser's painting on the cover. But yeah, thank you for the question. I'd love to talk more about snow, but better to read Walser.
Well, I think this brings us to the end with the concept of endings. The last question was to talk about endings, and you sort of wrapped that up beautifully. Thank you both so much for joining us. Edwin, again, thank you for joining us. And Tom, thank you for your heroic work to get internet access to your home in order to join us this evening.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Edwin.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Tom, and thank everybody. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
And good night.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Well.